The nurse was hired to take care of a woman in a vegetative state. One day when no one was looking, the nurse approached the woman, and what happened next? The soft hum of medical equipment filled the room, blending with the sound of Emily's hesitant footsteps. The dim light cast long shadows on the sterile white walls, creating an eerie atmosphere. Emily, a young nurse in her late 20s, had just started her shift. Her new assignment was to care for Mrs. Thompson, a woman in a vegetative state. Emily had been briefed on the basics: feed her through a tube, monitor her vitals, and ensure she was comfortable. However, the real task was far more daunting. Emily paused at the door, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was small, with a single bed in the center, surrounded by various medical machines. The soft beep of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of the life that lingered in the room. Mrs. Thompson lay motionless on the bed, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were closed, and her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. As Emily approached the bed, she noticed the personal items scattered around the room. A framed photograph of Mrs. Thompson with her family sat on the bedside table. They looked happy, smiling at the camera. There was a vase of wilted flowers, a stack of well-worn books, and a handmade quilt covering the lower half of Mrs. Thompson's body. These small touches of humanity contrasted sharply with the clinical setting. Emily reached out and gently touched Mrs. Thompson's hand. It was cold and unresponsive. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," she said softly. "I'm Emily. I'll be taking care of you from now on." Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued, "I hope we can get to know each other, even if you can't respond." She set to work, checking the tubes and monitors. Her movements were careful and deliberate, her training taking over as she went through the motions. Despite the routine nature of the tasks, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She glanced at the door, half expecting someone to walk in and tell her it was all a mistake, that she wasn't supposed to be here. But no one came. She was alone with Mrs. Thompson. Over the next few days, Emily settled into a routine. She arrived early in the morning, greeted Mrs. Thompson, and began her duties. She talked to her patient, recounting stories from her own life, describing the weather outside, and reading aloud from the books in the room. It was a one-sided conversation, but Emily found solace in the routine. She hoped, perhaps irrationally, that Mrs. Thompson could hear her and that her words brought some comfort. One afternoon, as Emily was adjusting the pillows, she noticed something strange. Mrs. Thompson's fingers twitched, just slightly. Emily froze, staring at the hand, waiting to see if it would move again. But it didn't. She told herself it was just a muscle spasm, a common occurrence in patients like Mrs. Thompson. Still, it left her feeling uneasy. Emily decided to mention it to Dr. Harris, the physician overseeing Mrs. Thompson's care. She found him in his office, a small, cluttered space filled with medical journals and paperwork. "Dr. Harris, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, standing in the doorway. He looked up from his desk, his brow furrowed. "Of course, Emily. What's on your mind?" "It's about Mrs. Thompson," she began, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I noticed something unusual today." Her fingers twitched while I was adjusting her pillows. "I thought it might be important to mention." Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's not uncommon for patients in vegetative states to have occasional muscle spasms," he explained. "But I'll make a note of it and keep an eye on her. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." Emily nodded, feeling somewhat reassured. "I just wanted to make sure I was doing everything right." "You're doing a great job, Emily," Dr. Harris said with a small smile. "Keep up the good work." Back in Mrs. Thompson's room, Emily resumed her duties. As the days passed, she grew more comfortable in her role. She started to notice other small details about Mrs. Thompson: the faint scar above her left eyebrow, the slight curl in her hair, and the way her lips parted ever so slightly when she breathed. These details made Mrs. Thompson seem more human, more real. One evening, as Emily was reading aloud from one of the books, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with graying hair and a weary expression. He wore a suit, slightly rumpled, as if he had been wearing it for days. "Can I help you?" Emily asked, closing the book and standing up. The man nodded. "I'm John Thompson," he said. "I'm Claire's husband." Emily felt a pang of sympathy for him. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Thompson. I've been taking care of your wife." He stepped into the room, looking at his wife with a mixture of sadness and longing. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate everything you're doing for her." Emily watched as he approached the bed, taking his wife's hand in his. "I talk to her," she said, feeling the need to fill the silence. "I tell her about my day, read to her. I hope it helps." John nodded, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. "She loved to read," he murmured. "Always had a book in her hand." There was a heavy silence in the room, filled only with the sound of the machines and Mrs. Thompson's steady breathing. Emily felt like an intruder in this intimate moment, but she didn't want to leave Mr. Thompson alone. "If you need anything, please let me know," she said softly. "Thank you, Emily," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As the weeks turned into months, Emily and John developed a routine of their own. He visited almost every evening, sitting quietly by his wife's side while Emily continued her care. They talked occasionally, sharing small snippets of their lives, but mostly they sat in companionable silence. One day, as Emily was tidying up the room, John spoke up. "Do you believe she can hear us?" Emily paused, considering her answer. "I like to think so," she said finally. "I think it's important to believe that our words and actions matter, even if we don't see immediate results." John nodded thoughtfully. "I hope so too. I want her to know that I'm here, that I haven't given up on her." Emily smiled gently. "She knows, Mr. Thompson. She knows." The bond between them grew stronger, united by their shared hope for Mrs. Thompson's recovery. Emily found herself caring deeply for the family, feeling a sense of responsibility and connection that went beyond her professional duties. Every day, she entered the room with renewed determination, speaking to Mrs. Thompson with warmth and compassion, believing that, somehow, her presence made a difference. And in those quiet moments, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and the whispers of hope, Emily felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. The weeks melded into a gentle routine, and Emily became a familiar presence in Mrs. Thompson's room. Each morning, she arrived with a fresh sense of purpose, greeting Mrs. Thompson softly, and began her meticulous tasks. The room, once cold and clinical, now felt almost homely with Emily's consistent presence and gentle touches. One quiet afternoon, Emily sat by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, reading aloud from a novel she had found on the shelf. The rhythmic sound of her voice filled the room, interspersed with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. As she read, Emily occasionally glanced at Mrs. Thompson's face, looking for any sign of recognition or response, but there was none. Suddenly, Emily felt a strange sensation, as if someone were watching her. She paused, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. She looked around the room, but it was empty, save for her and Mrs. Thompson. Shaking off the feeling, she resumed reading, but the sense of being watched lingered, making her feel slightly uneasy. That evening, John Thompson arrived for his usual visit. He greeted Emily with a tired smile and took his place by his wife's side. Emily continued her tasks, but the earlier sensation still bothered her. She decided to confide in John. "Mr. Thompson," she began hesitantly, "have you ever felt like someone was watching you when you're here?" John looked up, a curious expression on his face. "No, I can't say I have." "Why do you ask?" Emily bit her lip, unsure how to explain. "It's just, sometimes I get this strange feeling, like there's someone else in the room. It's probably just my imagination." John nodded thoughtfully. "This place can do that to you. Hospitals have a way of playing tricks on the mind." Emily nodded, relieved by his understanding. "You're probably right." The days continued to pass in a blur of routine. Emily grew more attached to Mrs. Thompson, feeling a deep sense of responsibility and care. She often found herself talking to Mrs. Thompson as if she were a friend, sharing stories and little details about her life. One day, as Emily was arranging the flowers on the bedside table, she noticed a faint movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, but Mrs. Thompson lay still. As always. Emily frowned, her heart racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Determined to understand, Emily began to pay closer attention to Mrs. Thompson's subtle reactions. She noted any slight changes in breathing, any flicker of movement. Her observations, though minute, began to build a picture that suggested there might be more going on beneath the surface. Emily decided to confide in Dr. Harris again. She found him in his office, going through his usual stack of paperwork. "Dr. Harris, can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady but insistent. He looked up, noticing the serious expression on her face. "Of course, Emily. What's on your mind?" "I've been noticing some small changes in Mrs. Thompson's condition," Emily began, choosing her words carefully. "Subtle movements, changes in her breathing. I think there might be more going on than we realize." Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "It's possible, but we have to be cautious. Patients in vegetative states can have involuntary movements. It doesn't necessarily mean they're regaining consciousness." "I understand that," Emily replied, "but I think it's worth looking into. Maybe there's something we're missing." Dr. Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, I'll take a closer look at her next time I do my rounds. But don't get your hopes up, Emily." "Thank you, Dr. Harris," Emily said, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. Back in Mrs. Thompson's room, Emily resumed her duties with renewed determination. She spoke to Mrs. Thompson more deliberately, watching closely for any reaction. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's patience began to wane, but she remained vigilant. One quiet evening, John arrived as usual. He seemed more tired than usual, his shoulders slumped with the weight of unspoken worries. Emily decided to share her observations with him, hoping it might give him a glimmer of hope. "Mr. Thompson, I've been noticing some small changes in your wife," she said gently. "I've spoken to Dr. Harris, and he's going to look into it. I just thought you should know." John's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope breaking through his weary expression. "Do you really think there's a chance she might wake up?" "I don't want to give you false hope," Emily replied carefully, "but I do think it's possible there's more going on than we can see. I just thought you should be aware." John nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Emily. That means a lot to me." As the weeks went by, Emily's bond with Mrs. Thompson and her husband deepened. She felt a sense of purpose and connection that she hadn't experienced in her previous assignments. Her dedication to Mrs. Thompson grew stronger, fueled by the small signs of hope she observed. One particularly quiet afternoon, as Emily sat reading by the bedside, she felt a slight pressure on her hand. She looked down and saw Mrs. Thompson's fingers move ever so slightly. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared, hardly daring to breathe. "Mrs. Thompson," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" There was no response, but the slight movement of the fingers was enough to make Emily's heart race with hope. She decided to inform Dr. Harris immediately, her mind buzzing with possibilities. "Dr. Harris, it's Emily," she said breathlessly as she found him in the hallway. "I just felt Mrs. Thompson's hand move. It was slight, but it was real." Dr. Harris looked at her, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity in his eyes. "Are you sure it wasn't just another muscle spasm?" "I'm sure," Emily insisted. "Please, just take a look." Dr. Harris followed Emily back to the room, where they both observed Mrs. Thompson closely. After a few tense minutes, there was another slight movement of her fingers. Dr. Harris's eyes widened slightly, and he nodded. "All right, Emily. We'll run some tests and see if we can find any more signs of improvement." Emily felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Harris. I really believe there's something there." The following days were filled with anticipation and cautious hope. Emily continued her vigilant care, watching for any further signs of movement or awareness. The bond between her, Mrs. Thompson, and John grew stronger, united by the shared glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Thompson was beginning to wake up. As Emily sat by the bedside one evening, she felt a deep sense of connection and purpose. The journey was far from over, but she was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. The unseen connection between them gave her strength, and she knew that together, they would face whatever came next. The air was heavy with anticipation as Emily stepped into Mrs. Thompson's room the next morning. The slight movement of Mrs. Thompson's fingers the previous day had reignited her determination. She greeted Mrs. Thompson with her usual soft tone, but there was an underlying excitement in her voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," she said, smoothing the blanket. "Today is going to be a good day. I can feel it." Emily began her routine, meticulously checking the tubes and monitors, ensuring everything was in order. She took her time, observing every detail, hoping for any small sign of improvement. As she worked, her mind wandered to the journal she had found among Mrs. Thompson's belongings, a leather-bound book filled with handwritten entries. She hadn't had the chance to read much of it yet, but today she felt compelled to dive deeper. During her lunch break, Emily sat in the staff lounge with the journal. The pages were filled with memories, thoughts, and reflections. Mrs. Thompson's handwriting was neat, each word carefully penned. Emily found herself engrossed in the life of this woman she barely knew, yet felt so connected to. The entries painted a picture of a vibrant, intelligent woman who loved her family dearly. There were mentions of her husband, John, and their children, along with anecdotes about their lives together. Emily smiled as she read about their family vacations, holiday traditions, and the little moments that made up their lives. But as she continued reading, the tone of the entries began to change. The once cheerful notes turned somber, filled with worry and uncertainty. Mrs. Thompson wrote about feeling watched, about sensing that something wasn't right. There were mentions of strange occurrences and her growing fear that someone was trying to harm her. Emily's heart raced as she read these words. The last entry was the most disturbing. It spoke of a car accident, an event that seemed to be the culmination of all her fears. Mrs. Thompson had written about her suspicions, about feeling that the accident was no accident at all. Emily closed the journal, her mind reeling. Could it be possible that Mrs. Thompson's condition was not just an unfortunate accident? She felt a knot forming in her stomach. She needed to find out more. That evening, John arrived for his usual visit. Emily decided it was time to share her findings with him. She waited until he had settled into his chair by the bed before speaking. "Mr. Thompson," she began cautiously, "I've been reading Mrs. Thompson's journal. There are some things you might want to know." John looked up, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What kind of things?" Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She wrote about feeling like she was being watched, and about a car accident that she believed wasn't an accident. "I think she suspected someone was trying to hurt her." John's face paled, and he leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. "I knew she was worried about something, but I didn't realize." "Do you think there's any truth to it?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But I think it's worth looking into. There might be something we're missing." John nodded slowly, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to find out what happened. Claire deserves the truth." The next day, Emily approached Dr. Harris again. She explained what she had found in the journal and her growing suspicions. Dr. Harris listened attentively, his expression serious. "Emily, these are serious allegations," he said finally. "If there's any truth to this, we need to proceed carefully. I'll review Mrs. Thompson's medical records and see if there's anything that stands out." "Thank you, Dr. Harris," Emily said, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. As the investigation began, Emily found herself more deeply involved. She spent her free time researching Mrs. Thompson's past, looking for any clues that might support her suspicions. She reached out to colleagues and friends, trying to piece together the puzzle. One afternoon, as she was organizing Mrs. Thompson's belongings, Emily found another clue, a stack of letters tucked away in a drawer. They were addressed to Mrs. Thompson from various people, including her husband and friends. Emily carefully read through them, looking for anything unusual. One letter stood out. It was from a friend who mentioned a heated argument she had witnessed between Mrs. Thompson and her husband shortly before the accident. The friend expressed concern for Mrs. Thompson's safety, suggesting that she be careful. Emily's heart pounded as she read the letter. Could John have had something to do with the accident? The thought was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. She decided to confront John with what she had found. That evening, when he arrived, she took a deep breath and approached him. "Mr. Thompson, I found something else," she said, handing him the letter. John read the letter, his expression growing more troubled with each word. "I remember that argument," he said quietly. "It was about money. Claire was worried about some investments I had made. We argued, but I would never. I loved her, Emily." Emily felt a pang of sympathy but also a renewed sense of determination. "I believe you, Mr. Thompson. But we need to find out who might have wanted to hurt her. There's too much at stake to leave any stone unturned." John nodded, his resolve firm. "You're right. We need to find the truth." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Emily and John worked together, digging deeper into Mrs. Thompson's life and the circumstances surrounding the accident. They spoke to friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have had information. Dr. Harris, too, was diligently reviewing the medical records. He found inconsistencies that suggested possible tampering, further fueling their suspicions. Emily's unease grew, but so did her determination to uncover the truth. One evening, as Emily sat by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, she felt a strange sense of calm. She took Mrs. Thompson's hand and spoke softly, as she always did. "Mrs. Thompson, we're going to find out what happened to you," she whispered. "We're not going to give up. I promise." As she sat there, the room filled with the quiet hum of the machines, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a nurse caring for a patient, she was a protector, an advocate for the truth. And she was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. The tension in the air was palpable as Emily entered Mrs. Thompson's room. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, and the reality of what might have happened to Mrs. Thompson weighed heavily on her. She was determined to uncover the truth, but she knew the journey would not be easy. Emily continued her daily routine with Mrs. Thompson, but her mind was constantly racing, trying to piece together the clues. She had shared everything she found with John and Dr. Harris, and they had all agreed to proceed with caution. There was a growing sense of urgency, as if time were running out. One afternoon, as Emily was preparing Mrs. Thompson's medication, John arrived, looking more agitated than usual. He had a determined glint in his eyes that Emily hadn't seen before. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. Emily nodded, setting aside the medication. "What's going on, Mr. Thompson?" "I've been thinking a lot about what we found," he began, his hands clenched into fists. "And I believe we're onto something. But we need more concrete evidence. I've been going through Claire's financial records, and I found some discrepancies. There are large sums of money that are unaccounted for." Emily's eyes widened. "Do you think someone was stealing from her?" John nodded. "It's possible. I've reached out to a private investigator to help us dig deeper. We need to find out where that money went and who was involved." Emily felt a surge of hope. "That's a great idea, Mr. Thompson. The more information we have, the better." As they spoke, Dr. Harris entered the room, carrying a file. He looked serious, his usually calm demeanor replaced with concern. "I've been reviewing Mrs. Thompson's medical records," he said, joining them. "And there are some troubling inconsistencies. It appears that some of her medications were altered, possibly to keep her in a vegetative state. I've consulted with a colleague, and he agrees that something is off." Emily's heart pounded. "So, someone has been deliberately keeping her in this condition?" Dr. Harris nodded gravely. "It seems that way. We need to proceed carefully, but we must act quickly. If someone is responsible for this, they need to be stopped." John's face darkened with determination. "We can't let them get away with this. Claire deserves justice." The three of them agreed to work together, each using their strengths to uncover the truth. John continued to dig into the financial records with the help of a private investigator, while Dr. Harris focused on gathering medical evidence. Emily, meanwhile, kept a close eye on Mrs. Thompson, looking for any further signs of improvement. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation began to bear fruit. The private investigator uncovered a series of suspicious transactions linked to a shell company, and further digging revealed that the company was tied to Dr. Carlson, a colleague of Dr. Harris who had been treating Mrs. Thompson before Emily's arrival. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she learned of Dr. Carlson's involvement. She had always felt uneasy around him, and now her suspicions were confirmed. They had a name and a motive, but they needed more evidence to bring him to justice. One evening, as Emily was about to leave for the night, John stopped her. "Emily, the investigator has found something. Dr. Carlson has been receiving large payments from Claire's accounts. We believe he's the one who's been tampering with her medications." Emily felt a surge of anger. "We need to confront him. He can't get away with this." John nodded. "We've arranged a meeting with the investigator and a lawyer. We need you there too, Emily. Your testimony will be crucial." The next day, they gathered in a small conference room. The investigator laid out all the evidence, including financial records, medical reports, and testimony from other staff members who had noticed Dr. Carlson's suspicious behavior. Emily felt a mix of nervousness and determination. This was their chance to bring justice for Mrs. Thompson. As they prepared to confront Dr. Carlson, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. They were dealing with a dangerous individual, and there was no telling how he would react. But she knew they had to press on. The confrontation took place in Dr. Harris's office. Dr. Carlson arrived, looking confident and unaware of what was about to unfold. Emily, John, Dr. Harris, and the investigator were all present, ready to face him. "Dr. Carlson," John began, his voice steady, "we need to discuss Claire's condition and some disturbing findings we've uncovered." Dr. Carlson frowned, glancing around the room. "What is this about?" The investigator stepped forward, presenting the evidence. "We have proof that you've been receiving payments from Mrs. Thompson's accounts and that you've been altering her medications to keep her in a vegetative state." Dr. Carlson's face turned pale, but he quickly composed himself. "This is preposterous. You have no proof." "We have more than enough proof," Dr. Harris said firmly. "And we're prepared to take this to the authorities." Emily watched as Dr. Carlson's facade began to crack. He glanced around, realizing he was cornered. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "I did what I had to do. Claire was going to ruin everything." John stepped forward, his voice filled with controlled anger. "You tried to kill my wife for money. You won't get away with this." Dr. Carlson looked desperate, but there was no way out. The investigator had already contacted the police, and they arrived shortly after to take him into custody. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had done it. They had exposed the truth. In the days that followed, the news of Dr. Carlson's arrest spread through the hospital. Emily continued her care for Mrs. Thompson, but there was a new sense of hope and determination in her actions. She knew that justice was being served, and she was more committed than ever to helping Mrs. Thompson recover. John visited more frequently, staying by his wife's side and talking to her, hoping she could hear him. Emily noticed more small improvements in Mrs. Thompson's condition, slight movements, changes in her breathing, and the occasional flutter of her eyelids. One evening, as Emily sat by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, she took her hand and spoke softly. "We did it, Mrs. Thompson. We found the truth. You're safe now." Mrs. Thompson's fingers twitched slightly, and Emily felt a tear roll down her cheek. She knew they still had a long road ahead, but for the first time, she felt that they were truly moving towards a brighter future. And she was determined to be there every step of the way. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden glow across the hospital room. Emily stood by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, her heart filled with a mix of hope and determination. The events of the past few weeks had been overwhelming, but there was a renewed sense of purpose in her actions. They had uncovered the truth, but now they needed to see Mrs. Thompson through her recovery. John entered the room, his face softened with a hopeful smile. He had been visiting more frequently, spending hours talking to his wife, holding her hand, and reading her favorite books. Emily had noticed the positive effect it seemed to have on Mrs. Thompson's condition. There were more frequent flickers of movement, more changes in her breathing patterns, and even the occasional flutter of her eyelids. "Any changes today?" John asked, pulling up a chair next to the bed. Emily nodded, her eyes shining with optimism. "I've noticed more movement in her fingers. It's subtle, but it's there. I really believe she's trying to respond." John's smile grew wider. "That's wonderful news, Emily. Thank you for everything you've done." Emily smiled back, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "We're in this together, Mr. Thompson. I'm just glad to see progress." As they continued their vigil, the room filled with a comfortable silence, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Emily took a seat on the other side of the bed, gently holding Mrs. Thompson's other hand. "Mrs. Thompson," she began softly, "we're all here for you. You're surrounded by people who care about you. Take your time, but know that we're waiting for you." John nodded, his voice filled with emotion. "Claire, I miss you so much. I can't wait for the day you open your eyes and come back to us. I love you." The hours passed slowly, but the sense of hope in the room was palpable. Emily and John continued to talk to Mrs. Thompson, sharing memories, stories, and words of encouragement. As the night deepened, Emily felt a growing sense of anticipation. Suddenly, there was a slight movement. Mrs. Thompson's hand twitched more noticeably, her fingers curling around Emily's. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Mr. Thompson, did you see that?" she exclaimed, her heart racing. John leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his wife's face. "Claire, can you hear us? If you can, please, give us another sign." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mrs. Thompson's eyelids began to flutter. Emily and John watched in breathless anticipation as her eyes slowly opened. It was as if time stood still, the world outside fading away. "Claire," John whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "It's me, John. I'm here." Mrs. Thompson's eyes moved, focusing on John's face. A tear rolled down her cheek, and her lips parted, trying to form words. Emily felt tears streaming down her own face as she watched this miraculous moment unfold. "John," Mrs. Thompson whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable. John broke into tears, leaning forward to kiss her forehead. "I'm here, Claire. I'm here." Emily stood back, giving them a moment to reconnect. She felt an overwhelming sense of joy and relief. After all the hardship, all the uncertainty, Mrs. Thompson was finally waking up. The days that followed were filled with cautious optimism and steady progress. Mrs. Thompson's recovery was slow but steady. She began to regain her strength, her speech improving with each passing day. Emily and John were there every step of the way, offering their unwavering support and encouragement. Dr. Harris monitored Mrs. Thompson's condition closely, adjusting her treatment as needed. The investigation into Dr. Carlson's actions continued, and he faced charges for his crimes. The hospital staff were in awe of Mrs. Thompson's remarkable recovery, and Emily's dedication was praised by everyone. One afternoon, as Emily was helping Mrs. Thompson with her physical therapy, they had a moment of quiet reflection. "Emily," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice still soft but growing stronger, "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. You saved my life." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It wasn't just me, Mrs. Thompson. It was a team effort. We all believed in you, and you found the strength to come back to us." Mrs. Thompson reached out and squeezed Emily's hand. "You gave me hope when I had none. I'll never forget that." As the months passed, Mrs. Thompson's condition continued to improve. She was eventually discharged from the hospital, able to return home with her family. Emily stayed in touch, visiting regularly and offering support as Mrs. Thompson adjusted to her new life. The bond between Emily, Mrs. Thompson, and John grew stronger. They became more than just patient and nurse, they became friends, united by their shared journey. Emily found a renewed sense of purpose in her work, inspired by the incredible strength and resilience she had witnessed. One sunny afternoon, as Emily sat in the garden with Mrs. Thompson and John, she reflected on everything they had been through. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought them closer together and changed their lives forever. "Life is a way of surprising us," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with warmth. "I never thought I'd be here, sitting in my garden with the people I love most. But here we are, and I'm so grateful." Emily nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "We've been through so much, but it's made us stronger. And we have a future to look forward to, filled with hope and new beginnings." As they sat together, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the beauty of the garden, Emily knew that this was just the beginning. They had faced their darkest moments and emerged victorious. And now, they had a lifetime of possibilities ahead of them, a testament to the power of hope, love, and unwavering determination. In that moment, surrounded by the people she had come to care for deeply, Emily felt a profound sense of peace. They had found justice, and Mrs. Thompson had found her way back to the people who loved her. It was a journey that had transformed them all, and one that would continue to inspire them for years to come.